Welcome into week 3 of the Playbook Pundits podcast here on SiouxCityJournal.com. I'm sports editor Zach James, and alongside with me, as always, is assistant sports editor Shane Lantz. Coming up in this week's episode, we'll talk about the games that we covered. I actually covered a game this week.
You did.
It was actually fun. And you'll talk about the game that you covered, and it was a pretty good one between North and East. And then we'll kind of run through the games that he's going to cover on Friday, and also with Barry Poe. And we'll also go through our list on the top 5 running backs in the Siouxland. But before we get to all that, let's take a look back at what happened last week. And Shane, it was a fantastic week. I'll start with the game that I covered on Friday night in South Sioux City between the Cardinals and the West Wolverines. And Let's finally broke their long losing streak. 24 games out the window, wadded up, throw it against the wall.
I was
it's
very
over.
jealous that you got to cover that. It looked like so much fun.
It was fun.
I was keeping up on Twitter, and I could just feel the tension rising. And yeah, what was the final play?
42-41. So that was the final score. The final play, so South Sioux scored in the first overtime to tie it at 41. So South Sioux coach Chris Stein said, you know what, let's go for 2. Let's not drag this out any further. Let's try and win it right here. They tried to go for 2. They handed it off to their running back, and West's front 7 all rushed to the running back, and it was pandemonium when they stopped South Sioux there. Everyone rushed onto the field.
Nice.
I think some of the fans rushed onto the field.
Love a good field rush.
It was a good field rush, and it was apropos. So I'm not a huge fan of court storming or field storming, but that was completely appropriate for the situation. And one of the reasons that West got to that point was Drew Benson. Mm-hmm. He had a heck of a night. He had, 168 rushing yards. He also had 100 plus in the air as a wide receiver, as quarterback Devin Fry found him in the backfield a bunch of times. West set the tone early, and the Wolverines haven't had the ability to do that many times in the last 3 or 4 years. They did a couple times last year, especially against North and South Sioux, but kind of like what Drew told me, and you can read this in Wednesday's Journal, he's the Metro Athlete of the Week. West plays good for a quarter, but they just get down whenever the defense gives up a touchdown. They get demoralized, and it all kind of crumbles on the sideline. That didn't happen on Friday night. They had it. They wanted it.
Yeah.
They had that feeling like they wanted to win, and whenever a team has that, they have a pretty good shot to come out on top.
Yeah, I mean, this is what they've been fighting for since 2018, like we mentioned. I mean, 2 straight winless seasons, and the head coach, he mentioned to me, like, they have higher goals than just winning one. I asked him, like, what is it going to feel like to finally get that win? And he said it's going to feel amazing, but we don't want to limit ourselves to just one. We want 5-6 good wins. I mean, I don't know if they're going to get that far this year. It might be a little bit lofty, but who knows? Maybe 2, maybe 3. If they can, they've already summited the mountain at this point. They just have to plant the flag now. Get a couple more, and then it'll be a very productive season.
And that's what Coach Brandon Holmes told me after the game on Friday night as well. Coach Holmes told me, that's great. We're going to celebrate it, but the work isn't done yet. This isn't the end-all, be-all. There are chances for the Wolverines to get more wins this year, especially coming up Friday against Des Moines Hoover. One win is great, but they want more. They want a second. They want a third. They don't want to be the laughingstock of the metro area anymore. And they proved on Friday night that they do have the capability of winning a game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just makes the whole metro scene that much more exciting when you have all 3 teams that are capable of winning and pulling upsets. I mean, if we ever get to the point where East, North, and West are all kind of co-equal,
that'd be awesome.
That would be just an absolute dream as a sports writer.
And something else that happened on Friday night that kind of caught my eye, and it's kind of similar to West's situation of winning. Des Moines Roosevelt beating Waukee down in Des Moines, and Des Moines' inner city schools hadn't beaten a suburban school since I think 2014. So that just goes to show you that inner city schools, whether it's Des Moines, whether it's Cedar Rapids, whether it's Davenport, or even Dubuque for that matter, or even here in Sioux City, they can beat suburban schools. And I think we're starting to see that corner turn where the city schools, especially in Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, in Sioux City, are starting to turn that corner. Now, certainly East is having some success. North is certainly having some success. Here comes West. Here comes West. And whenever you have the city schools be competitive the way that they have been, that just makes it more competitive. That just makes it more fun. And when you have better competition, when you have even competition, that makes it all the more fun. I don't care whether you're in Sioux City, Mason City, or Seattle. That just makes it more fun.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned even competition. I'm going to use that to pivot to East and North, which was not exactly quite as not quite as exciting to cover, but still is a good game to watch some athletes break out a little bit. I mean, East just dominated North 54-0, but head coach Mitch Moore for North, he did say after the game they're not 54 points better than us. He said we're gonna go in, we're gonna watch film, we're gonna fix our mistakes. I still have a lot of faith in North. I think they have some very talented kids. I think they just kind of ran into a beast in North. I mean, you have every podcast we have to mention Luke Longval. He had another good night, and they had a guy that I wrote about after that game. I mean, it was Tyon Jones, former running back last year. Now he's a wide receiver because they have 3 or 4 very good running backs on that roster. And by the end of the game, they were starting to take starters out, so his stats might not have been eye-popping. At the end, he had 5 receptions for 83 yards, 2 touchdowns. I mean, just that first couple drives, though, it looked like he was going to break out. 2 touchdowns pretty much immediately, and the 83 yards mostly came in the first half. Just a very talented kid. I was very impressed just with his speed, with his hands, and making that position change from running back to wide receiver. It doesn't seem like he has missed a beat at all, and I was very impressed with the night that he had.
Yeah, and both teams have chances to win this week coming up as well. We'll talk more about that. I'll talk more about that in the Coach's Show podcast coming up later this week, and we'll certainly talk about that in a live stream coming up right here at SiouxCityJournal.com coming up at 5 o'clock on Friday. So I have Metro Athlete of the Week this week, and that is on Drew Benson, and you can read about how he kind of fell back in love with the game of football, and he talked very glowingly about that after Friday night's game. But you have Siouxland Athlete of the Week this week.
I do. My Siouxland Athlete of the Week this week is going to be Lawton Bronson's Matt Peters. I have his numbers right here. Forgive the page turning. Last week, Matt Peters, who is a senior, he had 6 rushes for 176 yards and 2 touchdowns. Already an impressive night. But add to that 3 2-point conversions, 14 tackles as a linebacker on defense, and a punt return for 65 yards for a touchdown. I mean, that's a complete night.
Yes, it is.
I talked to his head coach, and I talked to him a couple nights ago, and his head coach was just blown away by the night that he had and the talent that this kid has. He mentioned he doesn't know where he wants to go, but he is interested in pursuing college football. Also a very, very good wrestler. So
Yes, he is.
A kid that you're going to hear his name a lot over the next couple months. And yeah, with going along with Lawton Bronson, they are now 2-0 for the first time since 2014. That is a program on the rise, and I think that Matt Peters, he's going to have a big hand in that, and I have a lot of faith in them to just keep on winning this year.
Yeah, huge credit to Jason Garnan and what he's been able to do with that Eagles program.
And this is only his first year as the head coach, too.
That's really impressive for him in his first year to take the Eagles to a 2-0 record for the first time in 7 years. It seems like the kids are really buying into that. Did Matt talk about that at all, about how the guys are buying in so far?
Yeah, him and Garland, they both mentioned just that there's been a little bit just a change in attitude, a little bit of change in faith and buying into the program. And Matt, he didn't go into a whole lot of detail about it, but he just kind of mentioned that there's more energy this year now that they have a couple of wins under their belt, and especially with his own performance on Friday. I think the other kids, they saw what's possible. I mean, he might be the far and away best athlete on that team, so maybe they can't all rush for 176 yards or whatever. But I think they've seen that they have enough explosive players, they have enough talent that any week that they play, they are very much capable of pulling out a big win.
Speaking of Peters, as we pivot to our top 5 running backs, I believe Mr. Peters is on your list.
Indeed he is.
Go through your list if you would, please.
Well, my top 5 list, forgive another page turn here, in my top 5 running backs, no particular order really. I have Matt Peters, like we just mentioned, from Lawton Bronson. I have Jackson DeWald from Westwood. Last week he had 214 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns, so a very big night for him. The guy that we also just talked about, Drew Benson.
Yes.
168 yards, 2 touchdowns, and you said 7 catches for 123 yards.
Something like that, yeah, that sounds right, actually.
And an 85-yard, was it a...
Kickoff return. And that was going to be the play of the week I was going to talk about, too. And it was in the second half. It gave West momentum right back, and it was a huge kickoff return. And special teams isn't something you kind of think about with West, but special teams played just as big of a factor on Friday night as the offense and defense did too.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, as a football fan and as a sports writer, when you have a kickoff return or a punt return, anything special teams, that is the most exciting moment of the game because you don't expect to see a kid rush for 100 yards back the other way. You expect to see him go out, 20, 25, 30 yards, get tackled, you start the drive, you're like, oh no, touchdown, like right away. So that's my personal favorite moment in football is kick return, punt return, touchdowns. But apropos of nothing there, with Drew Benson, he is on my list. Number 4 is Sioux Central's Ethan Mills, 30 for 147 yards last week and 5 touchdowns. Very big night, so he makes the list this week. And then another kid we mentioned earlier, Tyon Jones, 2 touchdowns, 83 yards. Just a good kid, very, very excited to see what he can do this year.
So I agree. I had 2 of those kids on my list as well, but I kind of pivoted and went with 3 other kids. One of the kids that you didn't pick that I did is Mason Dixon Newell Fonda.
Very good choice.
Yes, he only has 9 carries so far, but he has 204 yards. And of those 9 carries, 6 of them have been for touchdowns. So when he gets the ball, he just finds a way to just find the end zone. He just gets open, he breaks tackles, and he finds the end zone. And he's a very elusive athlete for Newell Fonda, not only in football. I think he's going to have a really good basketball season as well. And I think he'll have a good baseball season as well, and he'll probably make some noise on the track as well. So for Mason to kind of set the tone there for the Mustangs is a really big thing. One of the other running backs that I had on my list that he didn't is Ridgeview's Cade Harrigan. I forgot to write down his stats, but he's had a couple touchdowns. Ridgeview's off to a decent start this season, and so for Harrigan to kind of set the tone for the Raptors is a really good thing as well. The last guy I had on my list, I haven't seen him play, but you have, is Evan Heitch of Laurel Concord Coleridge over on the Nebraska side. Yes, got it. Can't forget about those Nebraska kids.
I know. I drove out there a couple weeks ago for my week 1 game. I mean, wonderful little small town atmosphere, great little stadium, and Evan, I think if I remember right, it was first play from scrimmage, went 65 yards for a TD. Second play from scrimmage went 60 yards, so that's 2 plays, probably not even 5 minutes of game time. He had 2 touchdowns on 125 yards.
That's impressive. And even when I read your story, I'm like, hey, this kid is kind of impressive, and that's why I picked him as my 5th running back. And if he can continue to do that through these next couple weeks, that's going to prove to be big for the Bears as they kind of try and make a district run on the Nebraska side. We aren't covering any Nebraska games this week, but he is not going to be on the Iowa side this week. Instead, you're going to be in North Sioux City to see what Dakota Valley has in terms of their roster as they take on Lennox. Now, we won't get into much of this game because that's what the live stream is for, but you get to see a game in South Dakota.
I know, the great north of South Dakota, which is a very strange phrase to say.
Yes.
But that'll be actually in my 6 months here. That's going to be my first game I've ever covered in South Dakota in person. So I'm excited for that. Excited to see Dakota Valley. I've driven by it a few times to go to the Adams homestead.
You drove by it yesterday.
I did indeed. Drove by that yesterday. But I'm excited to see them taking on Lennox, like you mentioned. We did say last week that we were hoping they could pull out a revenge win against Madison. Did not happen.
Didn't happen.
They got beat 46-13. But they have, like we mentioned many times before, a lot of new starters, a reshuffled O-line. They got Ethan Enema at QB, So he's coming in with a brand new experience. I believe he had a touchdown pass last week, if I remember right.
Yes.
And then, Randy Rosenquist is a talented wide receiver. So a couple kids I'm keeping an eye on there on Friday night. So, very excited for that.
Where can people follow you?
They can follow me on Twitter at Shane M. Lantz. You can just get more of my takes on Iowa, sports, South Dakota, Nebraska, but especially Washington State stuff, because I probably need to tweet less about Seattle sports, but it's just who I am.
That's all right. That's who you are, and that's how people can get to know about you.
Exactly.
Before we do sign off for the week, we're big baseball guys. The X's are the Sioux City
Indeed.
Explorers are in the playoffs this week. By some sort of miraculous turnaround, I didn't think they were going to make the playoffs a week and a half ago, but here they are playing in the South Division wildcard game coming up on Wednesday night against Cleburne. What's your biggest takeaway from this season for the Explorers?
Well, as people that follow me on Twitter may have seen, I went to that game yesterday in Sioux Falls. You can probably tell that I'm extremely sunburned on my arms because I sat in the sun for 3 hours. They have come back. They were in 4th place for a little while, and they stormed back over the last week or so.
Yeah.
I've been very impressed just with the grit and the hustle from that team. I mean, I talked to Steve Montgomery, the manager, after yesterday's game, as well as Jose Sermo. And Jose Sermo, he mentioned that they went from devastated yesterday because they lost their final game. It was a win and they were in, but they lost by a run to Sioux Falls. But then they found out a couple minutes later that Houston had won their game, which got Sioux City into the playoffs. And as I was walking toward the dugout, I heard them all start cheering. Even after they lost the game, I was like, well, there we go. The Apollos got it. So I've just been very impressed that they've managed to storm back. I'm looking forward to. Obviously, I'm not going to Cleburne in Texas to cover that game, but I will be covering it from the office on the live stream. Excited to see what they can do. They used their ace pitcher yesterday, so who knows who's going to be pitching. But I'm looking forward to seeing if they can pull that one out.
Congrats to the X's for making the playoffs for the 5th time in 6 years. To follow all of our sports coverage here at the Sioux City Journal, make sure to go to SiouxCityJournal.com. Follow the sports Twitter page at SCJ Sports, and if you have any suggestions, any ideas, anything of that like, email us at scjsports@SiouxCityJournal.com.
And where can they follow you?
They can follow me on Twitter at Zachary W. James. That's ZACHARYWJAMES. For Assistant Sports Editor Shane Lantz, I'm Sports Editor Zach James. Thank you so much for watching and listening if you're on the audio side. And make sure to come back Friday for the live stream at 5 o'clock at SiouxCityJournal.com.